The crisp morning air at Chicago O'Hare International Airport was filled with the usual hustle and bustle of travelers rushing to their gates. Among them was Rita Patel, dressed in a well-fitted navy blazer and carrying a leather briefcase that had seen countless courtrooms. As a senior attorney specializing in civil rights cases, she'd flown hundreds of times, but something about this Tuesday morning felt different. Flight 2471 to San Francisco was boarding on schedule. Rita had just wrapped up a major case in Chicago and was heading to the West Coast for a prestigious civil rights conference where she was the keynote speaker. Her presentation files were safely tucked away in her laptop bag, and all she wanted was a peaceful flight to review her notes. As she made her way down the jet bridge, Rita smiled warmly at the flight attendant checking boarding passes. The early morning sun streamed through the small windows, catching the silver threads in her dark hair, earned from 15 years of fighting for justice in courtrooms across the country. Inside the aircraft, Rita noticed the overhead bins were nearly full. Standing on her tiptoes, she tried to squeeze her carry-on into the remaining space. A young flight attendant named Amy noticed her struggling and stepped forward to help. "Let me give you a hand with that," Amy offered kindly. "Thank you so much," Rita replied with genuine gratitude, her voice carrying a slight hint of her Indian heritage mixed with her Chicago upbringing. That's when Captain Gregory Thompson walked past during his pre-flight check. He stopped abruptly, turning to face Rita with an expression that made several nearby passengers uncomfortable. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge that seemed entirely unnecessary for the situation. "Not at all," Rita responded professionally. "The flight attendant was just helping me with my bag." Captain Thompson's face darkened. "I couldn't help but notice your accent. Are you sure you understand all the safety instructions? Maybe you'd be more comfortable on a different flight." The cabin grew quiet. Passengers nearby exchanged shocked glances. A middle-aged businessman, a few rows back, pulled out his phone and began recording discreetly. Rita stood straight, her 5'4" frame somehow filling the narrow airplane aisle. "Captain, I understand English perfectly well. I was born in Chicago, graduated from Northwestern Law, and have been practicing civil rights law for 15 years. Is there perhaps another reason you're questioning my presence on this flight?" Instead of backing down, Captain Thompson's face reddened. "I'm the captain of this aircraft, and if I feel there's any potential security concern—" "A security concern?" Rita's eyebrows rose slightly. "Please, elaborate on what exactly makes me a security concern." By now, other passengers were openly recording the interaction. A quiet murmur of disapproval rippled through the cabin. Amy, the flight attendant, stood frozen, clearly torn between her duty to her captain and her sense of right and wrong. "Ma'am, if you're going to be argumentative, I'll have no choice but to remove you from this flight," Captain Thompson declared, reaching for his radio. Rita remained perfectly calm, though her heart was racing. She'd spent years representing clients in discrimination cases, but now she was living one in real time. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her business card, holding it up. "Before you make that call, Captain Thompson, I suggest you consider very carefully what happens next. Every second of this interaction is being recorded, and I can assure you, your airline's legal team will be very interested in reviewing it." The tension in the cabin was electric. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And that's when Captain Thompson made a decision that would change not just his career, but the entire airline industry's approach to discrimination. To be continued. The atmosphere on Flight 2471 grew more tense with each passing second. Captain Thompson grabbed his radio, his knuckles white against the black plastic. "This is the captain. I need security at Gate B23 immediately. We have an uncooperative passenger." Rita's heart sank, but her face remained composed. She'd spent years teaching young lawyers how to stay calm under pressure, and now those lessons were paying off. Around her, passengers began speaking up. "This is ridiculous," called out an elderly woman in a floral blouse. "She didn't do anything wrong." A college student who'd been quietly watching the whole scene stood up. "I've got the whole thing on video, ma'am. Every single word." Amy, the flight attendant, finally found her voice. "Captain, I really don't think." "That's enough," Captain Thompson snapped. "This is a security matter now." Two airport security officers appeared at the aircraft door, responding to the captain's call. They moved down the aisle, looking uncertain as they took in the scene. Dozens of passengers with phones raised, a perfectly calm professional woman, and an increasingly agitated captain. "What seems to be the problem here?" asked the first officer, a middle-aged man with kind eyes. Before Captain Thompson could speak, a businessman in first class stood up. "I'm Robert Chen, Executive Vice President at United Technologies. I've been sitting here watching this whole thing unfold. This captain is completely out of line." More voices joined in. "We all saw it. She was just putting her bag away. This is pure discrimination." Rita turned to the security officers, her voice steady. "My name is Rita Patel. I'm a civil rights attorney heading to San Francisco for a legal conference. Captain Thompson took issue with my accent while I was storing my carry-on bag, despite the fact that I'm a natural-born U.S. citizen. I have not violated any airline policies or federal regulations." The security officers exchanged glances. This clearly wasn't the disruptive passenger situation they'd expected to find. Captain Thompson's face had turned an even deeper shade of red. "As captain of this aircraft, I have final authority over who flies, and I'm saying she needs to leave." The older security officer sighed deeply. "Ma'am, I apologize, but we need to ask you to come with us. We can help you get rebooked on the next flight." Rita nodded slowly, gathering her belongings with deliberate care. "Of course. I understand you're doing your job." She turned to address the cabin. "Would those of you who recorded this incident please keep the videos? My office will be in touch." As she walked toward the exit, passengers began sharing their contact information with her. A young tech worker handed her a business card. "I live-streamed the whole thing to my social media. It's already getting shared like crazy." The second security officer, who hadn't said a word until now, leaned in close to Rita. "My sister's a lawyer, too. You've got this case in the bag." Walking back through the jet bridge, Rita pulled out her phone and dialed her law firm's number. Her colleague picked up on the second ring. "Hey, it's Rita. You're not going to believe what just happened. Get the team together. We've got work to do." Behind her, through the aircraft windows, she could see passengers still arguing with Captain Thompson. Several were demanding to be let off the plane in solidarity. Amy, the flight attendant, was frantically typing something into her phone, probably documenting everything she'd witnessed. As Rita reached the terminal, she noticed a group of journalists already gathering. Word had spread fast. A reporter rushed up to her, microphone in hand. "Miss Patel, can you tell us what happened on Flight 2471? She straightened her blazer and took a deep breath. Years of courtroom experience had taught her that the first public statement in a case like this was crucial. The next few words out of her mouth would set the tone for everything that followed. "What happened on that plane today," she began, "is about more than just one incident or one person. It's about accountability, dignity, and ensuring that every American can travel without fear of discrimination." To be continued. The terminal buzzed with activity as more reporters gathered around Rita. Camera flashes lit up her face, but she maintained her composure, drawing on years of high-pressure courtroom experience. Security officers stood nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the crowd grew. "Miss Patel, is it true the captain specifically targeted you because of your accent?" One reporter called out. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed. The airline's regional manager was calling. Rita smiled slightly. That was faster than she'd expected. She politely excused herself from the reporters, finding a quieter spot near a coffee shop. "Hello, this is Rita Patel speaking," she answered professionally. "Miss Patel, I'm Michael Davidson, Regional Director for Skyline Airlines. We've just been made aware of the situation on Flight 2471. I'd want to personally apologize for your experience." Rita listened as Davidson scrambled to do damage control. The videos were already trending on social media. Hashtag Skyline Shame was gaining traction, and celebrities were starting to retweet the footage. "With all due respect, Mr. Davidson," Rita replied calmly, "this isn't a situation that can be resolved with just an apology and a voucher for future travel. What happened today reflects a systemic issue." Back at the gate, Flight 2471 was experiencing its own drama. Through the large windows, Rita could see passengers standing up and gathering their belongings. At least 20 people had chosen to leave the plane in protest. A young woman who had left the flight approached Rita, still wiping angry tears from her eyes. "I'm Jennifer. I sat in 14C. I couldn't stay on that flight after what I saw. My grandparents came to this country with nothing but hope, and they faced the same kind of treatment. Not anymore. Not if we can help it." Rita touched Jennifer's arm gently. "Thank you. Every voice matters in this." Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was her law firm's PR team. The story had exploded online. Major news networks were picking it up, and they needed her to make a formal statement. Just then, Amy, the flight attendant from earlier, came rushing through the terminal. She had clearly made a decision that could cost her job. "Miss Patel," Amy called out, slightly out of breath, "I had to come tell you, this isn't the first time. Captain Thompson has done similar things before, but people were too afraid to report it. I've documented everything. Dates, flights, witnesses. I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Rita's heart warmed at the young woman's courage. This was how change happened, one brave person at a time, standing up for what's right. Security footage from the gate area was already being pulled and preserved. Rita watched as 2 more airline executives hurried through the terminal, their faces tense with concern. The situation was escalating faster than anyone had anticipated. A grandmother who had been watching everything unfold approached Rita with tears in her eyes. 30 years ago, the same thing happened to me. I was too scared to fight back then. Show them we're not scared anymore." Rita's phone buzzed once again, this time with a message that made her eyebrows raise. A prominent civil rights organization wanted to join forces. This was no longer just about one flight or one incident. It was becoming a movement. Through the terminal windows, she could see Flight 2471 finally pushing back from the gate, nearly an hour late and with dozens of empty seats. Captain Thompson had won the small battle, but he had no idea what was coming. Rita straightened her blazer and turned back to the waiting reporters. It was time to make her statement. But first, she took a moment to send a quick text to her mother. "Remember how you always told me everything happens for a reason? I think I finally understand." Taking a deep breath, she stepped in front of the cameras. Behind her, Amy stood tall, ready to share her testimony. Jennifer held her phone up, still recording. The airline executives huddled nearby, whispering urgently into their phones. "Today," Rita began, her voice clear and strong, "we have a choice. We can either accept discrimination as a normal part of life, or we can stand together and say, 'Not one more time.'" To be continued. By evening, the story had taken over social media. Rita sat in her law firm's conference room, watching news coverage play out on multiple screens. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since morning. The airline's generic statement about investigating the incident only added fuel to the fire. "Look at these numbers," said her colleague David, scrolling through his tablet. "The video's been shared over 2 million times. People are canceling their Skyline Airlines tickets. Their stock dropped 8% just today." Rita sipped her now cold coffee, reviewing the witness statements pouring in. The most surprising development wasn't the public outrage. It was the flood of emails from other Skyline employees sharing similar stories about Captain Thompson. A flight attendant from Denver wrote about how Thompson had made racist comments about Asian passengers during pre-flight briefings. A ground crew member in Seattle described how he refused to acknowledge female maintenance staff. Each story built a clearer picture of a pattern that had gone unchecked for years. "You won't believe this," called out Linda from the PR team, rushing into the conference room. "Remember Amy, the flight attendant? Her interview just went viral. She's talking about how she tried reporting Thompson 3 times, but management buried the complaints." Rita's phone lit up with another call, this time from a major morning show wanting her to appear live tomorrow. As she considered the request, her email pinged with a message that made her sit up straight. "Everyone, listen to this," she said, reading from her screen. "Dear Miss Patel, I was Captain Thompson's co-pilot 2 years ago. What I witnessed during those flights still haunts me. I filed multiple reports that disappeared into thin air. I have copies of everything. I'm ready to talk." The room fell silent. This was bigger than anyone had imagined. Just then, David's phone buzzed. "The airline's CEO just called an emergency board meeting," he announced. "Looks like they're finally realizing this isn't going away." Rita watched as more social media posts poured in. People were sharing their own stories of discrimination during travel. The hashtag had evolved from hashtag #SkylineShame to hashtag #TravelingWildRound. What started as one incident was becoming a national conversation about prejudice in the transportation industry. Her assistant poked her head in. "The civil rights organization is online too. They want to discuss filing a class action lawsuit. And you've got the morning show at 7 a.m. tomorrow." As Rita gathered her thoughts, another email caught her eye. It was from Jennifer, the young passenger who'd walked off the flight in protest. She'd started an online petition demanding Skyline implement mandatory anti-bias training. It had already gathered 50,000 signatures. Put the morning show on speaker, Rita decided. Everyone should hear this. We're not just fighting one captain's actions anymore. We're pushing for industry-wide change. Her team gathered around as she took the call. Outside her office window, the Chicago skyline glittered in the evening light. On her desk sat a photo of her parents at their citizenship ceremony 30 years ago. They'd taught her to stand up for what's right, even when it was hard. The producer's voice crackled through the speaker. "Miss Patel, we'd like you to share your story, but more importantly, we want to discuss solutions. How do we make sure this never happens to anyone else?" Rita looked at her team, diverse, dedicated professionals who dropped everything to fight this battle. She thought of Amy's courage, Jennifer's passion, and all the others who'd stood up despite their fears. "Tell the producer we'll do it," she said firmly. "But we're not just sharing my story. We're sharing everyone's story, and we're not stopping until we see real change." As her team sprang into action, preparing for tomorrow's media appearance, Rita's phone buzzed with a text from Amy. "Captain Thompson's been placed on immediate leave. The internal investigation is starting tomorrow. We did it." Rita smiled, but she knew this was just the beginning. The real work, changing hearts, minds, and policies, was still ahead. To be continued. The morning show's bright lights felt warm on Rita's face as she sat in the studio. It was barely 7 a.m., but the energy was electric. Beside her sat Amy, the flight attendant who'd risked her career to speak up, looking both nervous and determined in her navy blazer. "And we're back with our top story," the host began, turning to face them. A disturbing incident of discrimination on Skyline Airlines that sparked a national conversation. "Rita, take us through what happened next." Rita leaned forward slightly. "What's remarkable isn't just what happened on that plane. It's what happened after. Within hours of the incident, we received over 300 messages from airline employees sharing similar experiences." The host's eyes widened. 300. Yes, Amy jumped in, her voice gaining strength. For years, many of us saw concerning behavior but felt powerless to stop it. Some of us filed reports that mysteriously disappeared. Others were told to keep their heads down if they wanted to keep their jobs. Just then, the producer rushed onto the set, handing the host a breaking news update. The host scanned it quickly, looking surprised. Ladies, I've just received word that Skyline Airlines Board of Directors has called a press conference for noon today. We're told they'll be making a major announcement. Rita's phone vibrated in her pocket, probably her team with the same news. The investigation had moved faster than anyone expected, largely thanks to the mountain of evidence that had poured in from employees and passengers alike. After the show, Rita and Amy stood in the lobby, checking their messages. A group of flight attendants from another airline approached them, all wearing purple ribbons, apparently the new symbol of solidarity that had sprung up overnight. "Thank you for giving us courage," one of them said softly. "We're starting similar conversations at our airline now." Rita's phone buzzed again. This time, it was David. "Turn on your news app right now," he said urgently. Someone leaked Captain Thompson's personnel file. There were complaints going back 15 years. 15 years, Rita. And look who signed off on burying them. As Rita pulled up the news, she saw what David meant. The cover-up went all the way to senior management. Some of the same executives who'd been doing damage control yesterday had been actively hiding complaints for years. By 11:30, the sidewalk outside Skyline's headquarters was packed with reporters. Rita stood among them, Amy by her side, waiting for the board's announcement. The crowd parted as a group of pilots approached, all wearing the same purple ribbons. "We stand with you," their spokesperson said simply. "This isn't about one bad apple anymore. This is about changing the whole system." At exactly noon, Skyline's board chairman stepped up to the podium. The crowd fell silent. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as he adjusted his microphone. After a thorough review of recent events, he began, looking uncomfortable. "We have uncovered disturbing evidence of systemic failures in our complaint reporting system. Effective immediately, Captain Thompson's employment with Skyline Airlines is terminated." A murmur ran through the crowd, but the chairman wasn't finished. "Furthermore, 3 senior executives have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. We are implementing a zero-tolerance discrimination policy and establishing an independent oversight committee for all future complaints." Rita felt Amy grab her hand and squeeze it. But they both knew this wasn't just a victory. It was the beginning of something bigger. As reporters shouted questions, Rita's phone lit up with a message from Jennifer. "Check out the Airline Workers Forum. Every major airline in the country is talking about this. We're not just changing one airline, we're changing an industry." The chairman was still talking, announcing new training programs and policy changes, but Rita's mind was already racing ahead. This was an opportunity to push for industry-wide reforms, to set new standards that would protect everyone. Looking at the crowd, reporters, airline workers, activists all standing together, Rita remembered something her father used to say. Change doesn't come from waiting for the right moment. It comes from people brave enough to make any moment the right one. To be continued. The law firm's conference room was packed as Rita prepared for the biggest meeting of her career. Representatives from 5 major airlines sat around the table, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. The leaked personnel files had sent shockwaves through the industry, forcing every airline to examine their own practices. "Before we begin," Rita said, opening her laptop, "I want to show you something." She played a video compilation her team had put together, dozens of passengers and airline workers sharing their stories of discrimination. The room grew silent as the stories unfolded. "These aren't just isolated incidents," she continued. "They're symptoms of a bigger problem. And today, we have a chance to fix it." One airline CEO leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Patel?" Rita laid out the plan that her team had been working on day and night. A comprehensive overhaul of industry practices, from hiring to complaint handling. As she spoke, Amy stood quietly by the door, nodding encouragingly. The cost of implementing these changes would be significant, another executive pointed out. The cost of not implementing them would be higher, Rita countered, pulling up screenshots of canceled bookings and plummeting stock prices. Just ask Skyline Airlines. Suddenly, the door opened and Jennifer rushed in, apologizing for being late. Since starting the online petition, she'd become an unexpected voice for passenger rights. Her petition had now crossed 1 million signatures. Sorry to interrupt, Jennifer said, catching her breath, but you all need to see this. She turned on the news channel, where Captain Thompson was giving his first public interview. The room watched in stunned silence as Thompson tried to defend himself, but his excuses fell flat. With each word, he dug himself deeper, confirming everything the investigation had uncovered and more. Turn it off, one of the airline presidents said quietly. We've seen enough. Ms. Patel, what's your timeline for implementing these changes? Rita smiled inwardly. This was the opening she'd been waiting for. We've already drafted the framework. With your cooperation, we can have new policies in place within 3 months. The meeting stretched into the afternoon as they hammered out details. Rita noticed how the executive's body language changed from defensive to engaged as they worked through each point. This wasn't just about avoiding bad publicity anymore. They were genuinely invested in making things right. During a break, Rita stepped out to take a call from her mother. I saw Captain Thompson on TV, her mom said. Remember when we first came to this country, and people like him made us feel so small? Look at you now, Beta. You're making sure nobody feels that way again. Rita's eyes welled up, but she quickly composed herself as she returned to the meeting. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the conference room as they finalized the last details. One more thing, Rita said, pulling out a final document. We need to talk about the workers who've lost their jobs for reporting discrimination. They deserve to be heard. A murmur went through the room. This was a sensitive topic. Admitting past mistakes could open airlines to lawsuits. But then Amy stepped forward. If I may, she said, her voice steady. I represent hundreds of airline workers who want to make things better. We're not looking for revenge. We're looking for change. The CEO, who had questioned the costs earlier, nodded slowly. Included in the agreement. All of it. It's time we did this right. As the executives filed out, Jennifer caught Rita's eye and grinned. They both knew this was just the beginning, but it was a powerful one. David poked his head in. You're not going to believe this. Other industries are reaching out. They want to know about implementing similar reforms. Hotels, bus companies, even cruise lines. Rita gathered her papers, thinking about how far they'd come from that morning on Flight 2471. Her phone buzzed with a text from Amy. Just heard from more flight attendants. They're calling it the Patel Standards now. To be continued, 3 months after the Flight 2471 incident, Rita stood in front of a packed auditorium at the National Transportation Conference. The room was filled with airline executives, crew members, and industry leaders from across the country. In the front row, Amy sat next to Jennifer, both wearing the purple ribbons that had become a symbol of change. 6 months ago, if you told me I'd be standing here today, Rita began, I wouldn't have believed you. But sometimes the biggest changes start with one small moment of courage. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing the viral video from that fateful flight. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew the footage by heart now. But this isn't about that video anymore, Rita continued. It's about what happened next. She clicked to the next slide, showing the new industry-wide training program that had been developed. In just 3 months, over 50,000 airline employees have completed advanced anti-discrimination training. A hand rose from the middle of the room. Ms. Patel, what about the financial impact? Rita smiled. She'd been waiting for this question. I'm glad you asked. Let me show you something interesting. She pulled up a graph showing airline booking trends. The airlines that immediately adopted the new standards saw a 12% increase in customer loyalty. Turns out doing the right thing is good for business. From the back of the room, someone started clapping. It was one of the pilots who'd stood with them outside Skyline's headquarters. Soon, the whole room joined in. During the break, Rita checked her phone and found a surprising email. Captain Thompson had written to her. She hesitated before opening it, remembering all the pain he'd caused. The message was short but unexpected. Dear Ms. Patel, watching my grandchildren grow up in this changing world made me realize how wrong I was. The training program you developed opened my eyes. I can't undo my past actions, but I'm working with a local community center now, teaching young people about the importance of respect and understanding. Thank you for making me face my prejudices. Rita showed the email to Amy, who had wandered over with coffee. Well, that's something, Amy said thoughtfully. Speaking of changes, guess what? Our crew reporting app has logged over 1,000 incidents in 2 months. But here's the amazing part. 98% were resolved within 48 hours. The new system actually works. Back on stage, Rita shared more success stories. She talked about the airline that promoted its first female chief of maintenance, the customer service improvements that came with diverse hiring, and the rising employee satisfaction scores. Jennifer took the podium next, presenting data from her passenger advocacy group. We've seen a 70% drop in discrimination complaints across participating airlines, she announced proudly. But more importantly, passengers say they feel heard and respected. During the Q&A session, a young flight attendant stood up. I started flying 3 weeks ago, she said, her voice shaking slightly. During training, they taught us about Flight 2471 and the PATL standards. I just want to say thank you. I feel proud to work in an industry that's willing to learn and change. Rita felt her throat tighten with emotion, but she kept her composure. This was bigger than her now. It had become a movement that was changing lives. After the conference, Rita found David waiting with more news. The Transportation Committee wants to make these standards federal law, he said excitedly. They're calling it the Fair Travel Act. As they walked to their car, Rita noticed a family at the airport check-in counter, a mother in a hijab helping her children with their bags. The airline staff was treating them with visible respect and care. No suspicion, no extra questions, just normal, dignified service. Rita's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Just booked my flight to visit you next month. The customer service person was so kind. Things are really changing, aren't they? To be continued. 1 year after Flight 2471, Rita walked through Chicago O'Hare International Airport. This time heading to Washington, D.C., the changes were visible everywhere. From the diverse faces in airline advertisements to the multilingual welcome signs. At security checkpoints, new training posters reminded staff about fair treatment protocols. Miss Patel, called out a familiar voice. Rita turned to see Jennifer running her way, pulling a carry-on bag. I knew I'd find you here, ready for the big day. Tomorrow, they would testify before Congress about the Fair Travel Act. The bill would make the Patel standards federal law, ensuring equal treatment for all travelers across every mode of transportation. Look at this, Jennifer said, showing Rita her phone. The old Flight 2471 video had popped up in her memories. Hard to believe this was just a year ago. Everything's so different now. As they walked to their gate, they passed a training session in progress. Through the glass walls, they could see new flight attendants watching a documentary about discrimination in travel, the same one Rita's team had helped create. Remember Amy? Jennifer asked. She just got promoted to Chief of Crew Relations at Skyline. She's completely transformed their reporting system. At their gate, Rita noticed something that made her smile. The gate agent was wearing a purple ribbon pin, now part of the official uniform at most airlines. But more importantly, she was treating every passenger with the same warm professionalism, regardless of their appearance or accent. Rita's phone buzzed with a message from David. Just got the latest numbers. Discrimination complaints down 85% industry-wide. Employee satisfaction up 40%. Even the holdout airlines are asking to adopt the standards now. A group of pilots walked by, their uniforms displaying diversity badges. Another change that had spread across airlines. One of them stopped to shake Rita's hand. "My daughter just started flight school," she said proudly. "Thanks to you, she'll fly in a better industry than I did." As they settled into their seats on the plane, Jennifer nudged Rita. "Hey, did you see who's teaching at the Air Academy now?" She pulled up an article showing Captain Thompson leading a workshop on bias recognition. The man who had started this whole journey was now helping prevent others from making the same mistakes. The flight attendant doing the safety demonstration spoke in multiple languages, something that had become standard practice. Rita remembered how her accent had once been seen as a problem. Now, airlines actively recruited multilingual staff, seeing diversity as an asset. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over the intercom. "I'm Captain Lisa Chen, and I'll be flying you to Washington today. We're proud to be one of the airlines that pioneered the PATL standards, ensuring every passenger feels welcome and respected." Rita closed her eyes, thinking about tomorrow's testimony. She'd prepared for weeks, gathering stories from travelers and workers across the country. Each story showed how small changes had made huge differences in people's lives. Her phone lit up with encouraging messages. Amy sent a photo of her new office, where she handled crew relations with a team that looked like a mini United Nations. David shared pictures from other transportation hubs adopting similar standards: bus stations, train platforms, even cruise ship terminals. A flight attendant stopped by their row. "Miss Puddle, the crew would like to thank you. My brother used to hide his turban during job interviews. Now he's proudly wearing it as a ground crew supervisor." Jennifer squeezed Rita's hand as they took off. "You know what the best part is? Kids today won't know what it's like to feel unwelcome when they travel. They'll grow up expecting respect, and giving it too." As the plane climbed through the clouds, Rita thought about how far they'd come. Tomorrow's testimony wasn't just about making laws. It was about cementing a cultural shift that would protect future generations. To be continued. 18 months after the Flight 2471 incident, Rita stood at her office window, watching planes take off against the Chicago sunset. On her desk sat the newly signed Fair Travel Act, its fresh ink marking the culmination of a journey that had changed countless lives. Her phone buzzed with a video message from Amy, the former flight attendant, now Skyline's head of crew relations, was giving a tour of their new training center. "Look what we built together," Amy said, showing a wall of photos documenting their journey. Flight 2471's story was there, but so were the hundreds of positive changes that followed. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "The TV crew is ready," David announced. "They want to do the final interview in the conference room." Rita gathered her notes, though she hardly needed them anymore. This story had become part of who she was. In the conference room, the interviewer settled into her chair. "Miss Patel, when you boarded that flight 18 months ago, did you ever imagine we'd be here?" "Honestly." Rita smiled. "I just wanted to get to San Francisco. But sometimes life has bigger plans." The interviewer nodded. "The PATL standards are now being adopted internationally. How does that feel?" Rita thought carefully before answering. "What matters isn't the name or the recognition. What matters is that a grandmother can fly to see her grandchildren without fear. A young professional can go to job interviews without hiding their identity. A child can dream of becoming a pilot and know it's possible." Her phone lit up with a message from Jennifer, who was now running the largest passenger advocacy group in the country. "Turn on the news. Another airline just announced their first diverse leadership board. The interviewer leaned forward. Tell us about the ripple effects. Rita pulled out some recent statistics. Beyond airlines, we're seeing changes in hotels, cruise ships, train services, anywhere people travel. But the most important changes aren't in the numbers. They're in the stories people share with us every day. She told them about the young flight attendant who'd written to thank her. Now she could wear her natural hair without fear of discrimination. About the elderly couple who could finally travel with dignity, their accents no longer a barrier to respect. About the maintenance worker who'd been promoted after years of being overlooked. And Captain Thompson, the interviewer asked, what happened to him? He's become an unexpected ally, Rita replied. He travels the country now, sharing his story of learning and change. It's not about punishment, it's about growth. After the interview, Rita's team gathered for a small celebration. On the screen, they watched live feeds from airports across the country. Purple ribbons everywhere, diverse crews working together, passengers being treated with equal respect. Her phone rang. It was her mother. I just booked tickets for your father's birthday surprise, she said excitedly. The customer service was so wonderful. To think, Beta, all this started because you stood up that day. Rita shook her head. No, Mom. It started because hundreds of people chose to stand up together. I was just in the right place at the right time. As the evening wound down, David showed her one last email. A major European airline wanted to implement the standards. Looks like we're going international, he grinned. Rita packed up her desk, picking up the framed photo from Flight 2471, the one that had started it all. Next to it sat a new photo, her recent graduation speech at the Air Academy, speaking to a diverse class of future pilots. Walking through the airport to head home, she passed a young girl staring wide-eyed at a pilot walking by, a woman wearing a hijab with captain's stripes on her shoulders. The girl's mother smiled. Yes, sweetheart, you can be anything you want to be. Rita's phone buzzed one last time. It was Amy sharing their latest training video. Just taught the 1000th class using the new standards, she wrote. Each session, I tell them about Flight 2471. But more importantly, I tell them about what happened after. How one moment of injustice led to a lifetime of positive change. Looking up at the evening sky filled with departing planes, Rita thought about all the passengers on those flights. Each one now had a better story to tell, a better journey to make. Sometimes the best destinations aren't places. They're the changes we create along the way. The end.